Well, thanks everyone for joining our session here on redefining privacy, zero identity in a zero trust world. We'll get into the explainer about that here in just a minute. But I'm Steve Tout. I'm a consultant and an advisor in Olympia, Washington, to state and public sector. My background is identity security. I'm a podcaster. Most of these folks have been on my podcast. I've been here for 14 years, so I recognize a lot of your faces. Thank you for taking the time to join this session today. You're why we're here. But we're also looking to learn. I want to get started with introducing the panelists for the session. I'm going to start with Steve Wilson, who practically needs no introduction, but an innovator, researcher, analyst, and managing director of Lockstep Consulting. He's a familiar face around here. Michelle Dennedy. Michelle is the co-founder and CEO of a brilliant privacy startup called Privacy Code, right? Privacy Code AI. She's held privacy officer roles in multiple organizations that you've no doubt heard of, from Cisco to McAfee. Michelle, you're the co-author of a brilliant book on privacy engineering. So I think you're qualified to be on this panel. We'll debate that. Jeremy, also a familiar face around here, whom I'm informed today, he's in 4 sessions today. So I'm feeling a little guilty that I recruited him for this session, but his insights and thoughts on this topic are going to be very valuable. Jeremy is a managing director at a company called Venable and founding leader of the NSTIC, former senior advisor of NIST, has a background in business, technical policy, and finance issues related to identity and privacy, and is the coordinator for an organization called the Better Identity Coalition. If you're interested in that, he has a session at 4:30, which is a must-see. And then finally, we have Kay Turner. Kay is the Chief Identity Officer of FinCEN, the Department of the Treasury, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Among other things, she's led work that got FinCEN to publish their latest report detailing how $212 billion, that's $212 billion, in suspicious financial transactions in 2021 was tied to compromised identities. Kay, I hope, I'll just point out now that you've broke the pattern that the former panelists have all been on my podcast, and now you're obligated to join. And she has a paper. She gave me a copy of it last week. It must be online, and you can ask her to find out where to get it if you're interested in seeing it later. But we're going to get things started. I think we have a nearly full room here. And I'm going to just start right off with the context setting here about the title and the origin of zero identity. And to let you all in, it's not really an inside joke, but it's a real insight about where we're at in the industry. So, so Steve, I would just want to start it off with you. Help us travel through time to your keynote in Denver 2 years ago, where I've debated with myself, did you mean to say what you said, or was this just a tongue-in-cheek kind of a joke about zero identity? What were you thinking about, and why has this idea resonated?
Well, thanks, Steve, for taking so much interest in what was a glib aside 2 years ago. I was preparing for the keynote. I'd never done an Identiverse keynote. I was aware of that, conscious of that, trying to say something deep. And the night before, or was it over breakfast, I thought the way to close it was to be provocative and to be quoting something that I said at my very first Identiverse/CIS at Napa Valley in 2013, when I, conscious that something always dies at Identiverse, I said maybe identity is dead. Because there was a lot of discussion about attributes and fine-grained thinking about people and authorization, and what do you need to know about people. And then, of course, zero trust is a big thing. The inside joke, maybe it's inside my head, is just that I'm not really keen on zero trust. I think the language of zero trust is really mangled. I've heard people in one sentence say, the path to customer trust is zero trust. And I'm like, do we want trust or not? And then I thought maybe something that's a cleaner, semantically cleaner thing to say is to just, how about zero identity? And all I mean by that is that the one thing that we would all agree on is that there's far too much identity data floating, sloshing around, and we should try and do more with less. Maybe as little identity as possible.
Well said. We're going to unpack that later. And in true nonconformist fashion, Steve, I appreciate the honesty and the candor and the thought-provoking sentiments around, we hear a lot about zero trust these days, and, most of everybody is going to nod their head about, yes, let's use more of it. Michelle, your career is mainly focused on privacy. Again, you wrote this book on privacy engineering with, affectionately referred to PE number 1. You've spent a lot of time at this intersection of identity, data, and privacy. In fact, it's practically in your name. I just, wonder if you could weigh in on this notion of zero identity from a privacy perspective and weigh on, you've spent a lot of time around data. Share your thoughts from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, I promised to be spicy on the panel. When I was promised a zero identity, I promised I had no effing clue what that meant. So I share the skepticism in what does that mean, zero identity. I think if you look at zero as the ground truth, as the center of mathematics, as the way you get to any answer, as a central part of how you solve a problem, then sure, I'm all in on zero. I think it is the center of trust and truth. I think identity, particularly for privacy, I'm shocked at how disassociated identity has become from privacy. Privacy is the authorized sharing of data. It's not sequestration, it's not secrecy. It is sharing information according to context and time, ethics, legality, construction, and that cannot happen without contextual identity. So yes, I think there needs to be less identity criterion and data flying around that used to identify individuals. So we need to minimize the data that has been viewed as some sort of exhaust, this notion that privacy's dead because it's hard. Stop being a pussy. Man up. It's time for identity and privacy and security to be in the hands of people that are brave enough to get to ground zero, to actually face the truth that people are still important, people will remain important. AI is not coming for your jobs, AI is math. So that is my zero identity.
I think we could almost end this conversation right there. That's a mic drop moment. I love that sentiment. We've heard two like opposite ends of the spectrum about zero trust, privacy, data security, and to not ignore it, but embrace it. So Jeremy, I wonder if you can weigh in on here. You've spent a lot of time in the public sector where identity is a necessity. You don't really get public service from your state agency or a driver's license without revealing who you are. You advocate for best practices in biometrics, identity verification, and policy through your work. So weigh in on the issues of abuse and overuse of data from your experience.
Sure. Well, first, I'd love to associate myself with the comments of Michelle next to me, but I'm glad she said them here on this panel and not me.
I say the things out loud.
I appreciate it. Some things need to be said. Yeah, I mean, on the policy side, a lot of the work I'm doing these days is with a group called the Better Identity Coalition, which you talked about before. And if you want to really dive into it, we'll be doing a deep dive into our policy blueprint and report card grading parts of the government on how much progress they've made at 4:30 today. But it's essentially a group that was formed, I guess, about 6 years ago in the wake of the Equifax breach, when we had a lot of identity data suddenly out there, and a lot of consequences to that breach, and a lot of policymakers asking, as well as industry asking, what are the consequences of that and where do we go from here? And so we brought together a lot of firms, largely on the buy side, think big firms in banking and healthcare and tech and telecom, to think about what should the government actually look to do. And I think a lot of the model is not sort of the stale, outdated notion of a national ID, but something that sort of flipped that model on its head, which is, look, we're not trying to do more ID cards. We've got a lot of them already. In fact, it's our problem is everything stuck in the paper and plastic world. But if I have one of these things, I've already gone through that crappy experience of asking the DMV to figure out who I am. Can I just ask them to vouch for me when I'm trying to prove who I am online, or at least validate a few things about me? Maybe like with the attribute validation service that can provide a yes/no answer, to whether something I'm actually submitting matches and what's in their records. Or it could be something more robust, like what we're seeing emerge with mobile driver's licenses, verifiable credentials, other digital counterparts to the paper and plastic docs we have today. I think getting back to the concept of zero identity, or I don't think we're getting to zero, but I always love that Steve's looking to be a bit of a provocateur here, and then we get to argue about stuff. I think the real concern is with any of these solutions, how do you avoid identity maximalism? The idea that just because I need to ask for some sort of identity information about you, well, I shouldn't need to ask for all of your information, not in most cases at least. And so I think here, as Steve and Kay and others have heard me say, the need is not so much for identity, but rather validated attributes. I think that's sort of the key here. My ability as a relying party who needs to know a few things about you to transact with you from a risk mitigation perspective or a compliance perspective, or just the ability to deliver a personalized solution that's a little nicer for you. How do I get to know one or a few things about you, but I might not need to know everything about you? I did a speech last year at this conference called The Four Horsemen of the Self-Sovereign Identity Apocalypse, which is slightly provocative. But one of the things I talked about is, I think in the identity space, validated attributes are the new plastics, meaning for those who don't get the graduate reference because you're too young now or just haven't taken the time to go see a great movie, what's most important in identity right now, at least when it comes to identity proofing, identity validation, in my view, is the ability to find easy ways for consumers to somehow validate a few key things to a relying party. That may be a separate discussion from who you are.
Thank you, Jeremy. Kay, I got a chance to listen to you talk last week in Nashville. I did get to scan the report, and your comments prior to this session were actually pretty insightful as well about your experience and perspectives on identity. So before, feel free to share more highlights from the report. But views on identity from your position and the intersection of like this massive fraud where identity is used, right? And I don't think we're proposing here that identity is dead, even though that notion has been shared. But can you share your thoughts on where the trends are heading and what you're seeing?
Sure. So I was brought in 3 years ago to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We're the money laundering regulator and the Financial Intelligence Unit. I was supposed to advance the use of digital identity in an AML CFT context, thinking about our levers, working with federal agencies, federal financial regulators, and to people that are non-specialists, so not you guys, explaining what the heck a digital identity actually means. So for those that don't know FinCEN, understanding who is behind illicit transactions and working with the public and private sector to mitigate that are really at the crux of what FinCEN does. But I like to always bring it back to our daily lives. And I like to say my role is helping you with that niggling feeling that you have right before you're about to make a payment. Am I going to be scammed? Or that sigh that you heave when you hear that someone you know or a relative was a victim of identity theft. So we know that a lack of transparency around identity makes it easier to exploit processes and conceal illicit activity. Criminals are using fake documents to impersonate, deepfakes to circumvent verification processes, or to use compromised credentials. They're effectively exploiting gaps or breakdowns in processes at account opening, account access, and during transacting to conceal their identity and attempt to launder their ill-gotten gains. The main driver behind this is the challenge of finding accurate and easily attainable information about real-world people in a digital world. So we're trying to solve who's behind the keyboard. And we embarked on this project called the Identity Project 3 years ago. And what we sought to do was to leverage off NIST, Digital Identity Guidelines, the terminology, but in a simplified version, because AML CFT is much broader than NIST Digital Identity Guidelines, And we set up a framework called the Identity Project Framework. And it's effectively figuring out when in the process the exploitation is taking place in order to perpetrate the crime. And we used Bank Secrecy Act data because my colleagues said it's the internet. We can't figure out who anyone is. I said, let's quantify it. And so we used Bank Secrecy Act data to quantify and feed back to industry so that they could help make risk-based decisions on how to mitigate crimes. And we used a simplified language. So I'll use the bar analogy to explain the terms that we chose. We looked at impersonation, circumvention of verification, and compromise. So in the bar analogy, it's the bouncer that asks you for the ID. He's validating it's real ID. Obviously, the AI bot doesn't rock up to the bar, but online, that's an issue, right? And then in the verification stage, they're actually trying to make sure that the validated evidence, i.e. the driver's license, and you match. He gives you the bracelet, you go in the bar, you leave the bar to make a call or get air, and he's going to authenticate your bracelet when you go back in. And we looked at those steps and we said, oh, wow, you know, in the first instance, you could have a great synthetic ID to impersonate someone in the validation phase. In the verification phase, you could distract the bouncer, pay him off. It could be a deep fake telling you to make a $25 million payment. And in the compromised credential bit, so after you've gotten the account, you got the bracelet, you could sell it, you could rent it, someone could steal it. There are a lot of things that could actually take place. So we embarked on a project, the Identity Project, to write it up. It's called the Identity Financial Trend Analysis. You can find it on fincen.gov. To the lucky person that comes up, at the end of the panel, I got one free copy. But you can find it online. So the report, let me just walk through some of the key takeaways. Stephen mentioned the $212 billion of identity-related exploitations. They occurred in a variety of schemes. Almost 70% of the volume and 60% of the report values cited actually occur in exploitations that occur in impersonation, that first phase validation. Are you a real unique person? Is your identity evidence valid? General fraud was almost a third of the records. So this is not just AML CFT. This is also fraud, and that's close to $150 billion in identity-related exploitations. All these numbers are about 2021. We're busy doing 22, 23 numbers, so we're looking to publish again, show trend data. The use of compromised credentials had a bigger impact. They were 18% of reports, but they were close to a third of the values. Understanding how cyber crimes actually fit into this framework, like abuse of access, business email compromise, cyber incidences. They had the largest per incident monetary impact. And so our director, when we published this January 9th, when you're looking for the document on the fincen.gov, fincen.gov website, our director encouraged financial institutions to work across internal divisions to address departments to address these identity-related schemes. Effectively, we're providing financial intelligence with back the financial institutions, the financial intelligence they're giving us in an identity process flow in order to mitigate gaps or breakdowns. And it's in a risk-based kind of framework where you can analyze and address where it's actually taking place in the process.
And there's one free copy, mind you. There's a few dozen people in this room. In the interest of time, we're kind of at the last segment here. I'd like to just bounce this around. We've seen the real-world consequences of financial crime and the quantification of that in billions of dollars and the victims that are impacted by this. So it naturally makes us think about, well, what are the solutions that are available? And I don't know, where you all are coming from, whether public or private sector or financial services, but I think this may be the most important question, maybe the most important session that you're going to attend at Identiverse, and I'm biased. But data minimization is a pretty important topic. So, Steve, I wonder if you can, begin by sharing some of your thoughts, the practical considerations, after you recover from this notion of zero identity. What are the strategic considerations for data minimization and operations, and how does this approach benefit from both privacy and security in the digital landscape?
One of the really cool things about identity is how philosophical it is and how fun it is and how multifaceted it is. But a lot of us keep arguing about definitions, and some of us in this room have been arguing about what does identity mean for 30 years. And I think it's more interesting how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. Now, but you can get really practical, and I'm going to get practical immediately, which is when I say let's kill off identity, what I mean is be conscious of the words that we're using, and the word that we use, identity, is a proxy for some really incredibly complicated stuff that's different for every person in this room. I'm not denying anything that Kay does, because what Kay does is intensely important and it is worth billions and trillions of dollars, and identity is absolutely her concern. But for most of us it's not, and we all know that. We should start our design process in any digital system when we're dealing with a counterparty. We should not be thinking identity, because you're immediately over-identifying. There are some well-funded state government digital ID projects in Australia, and their communication is all over the map. And one of the things that they say on their website, one of the state governments says, this new digital thing on your mobile phone will help you prove who you are. And you've already confused the entire population, and you're thinking national ID, because that's what it sounds like. We don't need it. The practical thing is, start your design thinking with the question, what do you really need to know about the other party? And when you frame it that way, almost everybody says it's not going to be identity, it's going to be attributes, it's going to be entitlements, it's going to be qualifications. We should be disciplined in our design thinking. What do you really need to know? And then where are you going to get that data? Is it real-time data? Is it static data? Is it in a database? Is it on a plastic card? Is it signed from a mobile wallet? And the third thing is, how do you know if the data is true, or how do you know that the data is fit for purpose? So what sort of signals and metadata are at your disposal to allow you to rely on the core piece of thing that you really need to know, which might be that you're over 21 years of age? And we can all understand that. Go to a bar, you want to know if the person is over 21 years of age. Full stop, period. No identity, move on. It's about being disciplined about what do you need to know about the counterparty.
My first Identiverse was, I guess, 2012, and the industry has evolved and grown up quite a bit. It used to just be about authentication and single sign-on. Now we're looking at things that like data and privacy and regulations and impacts. So Michelle, in my journey, I stumbled across your book. There's this notion of privacy-enhancing technologies and privacy-centric design. How do you see these principles applying, whether at design time, if you're like a chief product officer or a product manager, or during runtime, if you're an engineer or an administrator, having these principles consistent across the life cycle of identity management?
Yeah, so I think unfortunately for privacy, we have a branding problem as well. I think the thought of privacy as something over in the corner as a human rights issue has sort of hampered things. When I think about data and I think about attribution and I think about quality, if you go back to things like the Zachman constructs or when you were looking at COBOL and you were looking at why are we still flying on COBOL? Why are our financial systems still being run on COBOL? Is it just because we're too lazy to replace those systems? Or is it because they were for purpose, built by a business problem with the data attributes and systems built always concentric around that problem, and it was really hard because you had a moonshot. When you had those punch cards, you had a moonshot. You couldn't just try a little and then try a little more and grab some code from hither and yon and try some more. You had a moonshot. And so you had to really think about how you were constructing your code to solve a problem. And I think we've lost our way. So when I thought about constructing with, I affectionately call my dad Privacy Engineer Zero. So he started in the 50s in engineering and thinking about how do you use systems judiciously to solve problems. And I still think about privacy engineering and how do I get from policy, all these wordy things, and aspirational outcomes all the way through QA. And what I started to do is, when I had to do a privacy impact assessment because it was the law. So I'd ask people, what are you trying to do? Well, I'm trying to hire someone. Great. What do I need to know? Well, they're not an axe murderer. They're not likely to murder other people at work. Good. Okay. What do I need to know? How long do I need to know that? Okay. I need to know that. When I put this stuff into systems and I do my privacy impact assessment, I ask my engineers to build a system. They think they're building a system. That's great. Once a system is out in the wild and interacting with other systems, that PIA is now wrong. The only person telling me the truth are the APIs that are sharing those attributes with other systems. So now they're telling a story about those individuals in play. So it's the system of systems, and it's thinking things through as what are the business problems, and business, as government agencies have business problems to solve, thinking through systems of systems, timeliness, contextualization, and constantly thinking a little more organically about identity. Just like you think about nutrition in your body. It's an apple, it's a part of Michelle identity, it's a part of waste. That's how we have to think about identity and data as it's flowing through. You wouldn't dig through a bunch of waste to look for lunch. We're looking through AI data through a bunch of waste. So as we think through how our systems are evolving and what the attributes are that we're gathering to try to create value and how we're processing them and how we're getting rid of those attributes, I think we have to change our mindset, be a little more old-fashioned, quite honestly, and get back into things like quality and testing and systems engineering and think through how all these disciplines are really interconnected.
I've just rewired my thinking. I think in my DNA as an identity architect that I now see myself as a privacy engineer who happens to know identity and architecture.
Exactly.
That's just the mindset shift you've just taken us through. Jeremy, can you break it down for us into some very practical considerations when you're planning for identity and privacy, maybe in identity verification processes, especially in the private sector in your work, and as you've laid out in the Better Coalition frameworks and documents that you've prepared?
Well, I think what Michelle teed up is, sort of a great way to frame it, which is a lot of times we say we want data minimization, but then somehow there's some things that we don't think about in the architecture, and we end up instead embracing a principle of what my old friend Colin Suter at Deloitte called data promiscuity, which we can have a debate over what that term means and if it's the opposite of data minimization or something else. But I get it. I think it's nice to have more data, and a lot of you, the companies you're in, wherever you work, as you're designing systems, you say, sure, why wouldn't we ask for everything and try to get access to all of this? And it generally works at least until people start to realize it becomes a liability. And so I think the biggest challenge is convincing people as we're architecting and building identity systems, how do we build them around focusing on only what you need to know and maybe not what you want to know, and also prevent maybe some of the spillage that Michelle was talking about. I think one challenge, something I'm thinking about a lot these days in the years to come, is as we start to see portable digital credentials emerge and it becomes increasingly easy for consumers to use, and then increasingly easy for relying parties to start asking us, well, why don't you, while you're at it, just tell us who you are? Is that going to somehow tilt the balance today in terms of what people's expectations are around what you have to provide about yourself to transact online? And look, there's one set of things that will matter a lot for industries like financial services or healthcare, but what about buying a pizza or ordering some jeans at the Gap? And so I think this idea of governance around, as we make it easier to share more information about ourselves, well, if it's too easy, how do we start to think about some guidelines and things we can put in place to make sure that we don't get to a somewhat dystopian future in terms of what that leads us to?
Thank you. And Kay, the same question for you, and I'd like to keep this brief because I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience if I can. I think we're getting close to the 5-minute mark. So how does the report, in your experience, is there anything prescriptive that...
So just a couple points. We recognize that there have been new additional tools, sources, and methods for collecting, identifying information, and verifying identity since we initially adopted our customer identification program rule in 2003. And we see technologies that will enable data minimization, like state mobile driver's license. We also see additional customer identifying attributes, email, geolocation, IP addresses, or a government attribute service like Social Security Administration's attribute validation service. We do recognize that they vary in how they were created, their data security features, their accuracy and authenticity, but they could be used holistically to actually, for a financial institution in a risk-based verification process, to actually understand their customers. We also have embarked on a request for information. It was published March 29th. It closed May 28th. We were actually looking at the requirement that our regulations have around covered institutions, collecting the customer's taxpayer information directly from the customer. So we're thinking about it.
Thank you. And I just looked at the time. So I actually have 20 minutes, and this says I've been talking for 40 minutes, or we've been talking for 40 minutes, so my calculation was an error. I think we'll just go one round. If you have questions, I'd like to have one or two of you share your questions, so be thinking about that. And if you have it for the entire panel or for one specific individual, we'll try to catch those at the end. But we're going to just finish. What's that?
Or we're not being spicy enough if you don't have questions.
Well, let's talk. Let's have a continuation of your conversation on ethics from yesterday and weave that into digital identity and privacy. Thank you, Nishant. There you are. You kicked us off yesterday. Let's continue that part of the conversation. And so Steve, connecting the dots from zero identity to zero trust. We know your thoughts about that. How can we align that to contribute to building trust, especially in the context of ethical considerations around the data usage?
There's the challenge for let's call ourselves collectively engineers for the most part. We're fairly precise. We're used to quantifying things. We're a bit uncomfortable with privacy sometimes because we want it to be absolute, and we want ethics to be absolute, or we want it to be a bit universal. But there's no one-size-fits-all ethical posture or privacy posture. Privacy is actually a lot like security insofar as it's never perfect. There's no such thing as perfect security. Everybody knows that, but there's no such thing as perfect privacy either. So you've got to have the discipline to know that you have to be asking questions in every single context or every single project. You start a project, you've got some sort of objective, marketing, business, somebody's given you functional and non-functional requirements. You know how to go through the question-asking process. The ethical questions and the privacy questions, I think, should be in that frame. And I still like to start with asking, what do you really know about, what do you really need to know about a counterparty, and get that information and get nothing else. And we're going to talk some more about privacy this afternoon, indirectly, Andy Hindle and I, but it is about what do you need and keep it at that. And I don't want to be too reductionist or reductive about it, but a lot of the ethical outcomes, I think, are emergent outcomes. They're meta-phenomena that will come out of doing a good job. And it's very unethical to say, I know how to enrol somebody, I'm going to grab their driver's license because that's the benchmark that they use in KYC. I mean, that is unethical because it's just brain dead. And it's stupid to be applying vanilla solutions. From every perspective, from an ethical, privacy, security perspective, it is stupid to apply this one-size-fits-all default assumption that we want to identify people. And that's what I mean. If I think that you could zero out anything, I would really zero out the word identity as a challenge. Try and spend a day at work in identity, and I know that we're at the identity conference, and I love it, but try and spend a day without using the word, and try and frame...
It's not the good day to do that. Maybe tomorrow.
Try and see how much you can do thinking about data.
So let's think about Monday morning. I remember how fun it was coming back from this conference and then having a ton of notes and having met a lot of vendors and being really excited to return back to work and share with my boss and colleagues everything I learned, and they could care less about what I learned. But Michelle, you have product managers, architects, some CTOs, people who are privacy curious. How can you make it practical for them on Monday morning, to go from where we're at to applying, ethical considerations to the design choices that they are going to have to make going forward? Yeah,
so we'll dig into Nishant's great session from yesterday for, I think, privacy engineering and ethical engineering are sisters. I think taking something that feels like human rights and something that's sort of religion, like I get to have an opinion about, and it's privacy, it amuses me a bit because it's legislative. There are rules. There's actual laws about privacy. You don't get to opine that privacy's dead. It's the law, dude. Hello. But it's like you can never see your CFO wandering into the boardroom going, I just wasn't feeling taxes today. I feel like taxes are overdone, so I only paid 70% of them. But you actually do, and I actually do train board directors, and I tell them about the Sephora case in California, and they say, $1 million isn't a lot. And I'm just gobsmacked by that. So think about, first of all, it is the law. So privacy is the law. The ethical considerations don't feel like they're as exigent. However, I will tell you that they will be extremely expensive. So thing number one, to get people to care in your Identa universe, ethical considerations when you're actually applying what you do that is so essential to making, you are the oil that makes everything run. No database runs.
Very quickly, what's one heuristic? What's one question that they can be asking?
Well, so this is the tee up, really, is why do you care about ethics if you're an identity purveyor? Because ethics, by definition, are the community understanding of how we interact with one another. And identity is the way that we signal to one another who we are and what is our community position in our community. And so ethics are the rules that say we drive to the right, we drive to the left. And so when we set our rules within our businesses, these are our ethical brand standards. These are the way we treat our customers. These are how we process and pay our suppliers on time. This is how we promote our employees. These are your ethics. So you've already got ethics, and you're applying your identity standards and how you're processing the humans that have these identity artifacts within them. So look at the ethics you already have, and then you can start to identify what your ethical constructs are today, and then you can start to gap fill and say, are we missing something, or should we be more transparent as we're starting to actually be more forward in actually putting out a strategic architecture in ethical engineering?
Jeremy? I can prompt you with the question, and maybe even getting beyond ethics, right? How do we go from ethics, which is, motherhood and apple pie, to, feet on the ground, doing, it's going from aspirational, let me say it that way, to what work actually needs to get done in a practical sense. If ethics scares some people or they just find it hard to grasp, what work is actually going to need to be done, either from adherence to policies and regulations to protect individuals' privacy and build trust in their identity verification?
Well, I'll start by saying ethics are nice, and I think most of the people in this room have the ethics. But there's some who won't. There's some who don't care, and I think this is where policy and law comes in. To Michelle's point, there is law that's out there. It's a mess right now. So we don't have a federal privacy law in the U.S. We've got a number of states all kind of doing their own thing. I work in a law firm, by the way. It's a great place to be right now if you need to comply with, what I think is heading towards 50 different states. I'll give you a card afterwards if you need some help on that front. But That aside, it's a hot mess. And then when we pivot over to identity policy, we basically have nothing at all, which is a real problem. I'll be talking about this maybe a little more emotionally in the 4:30 session today. But spicily, yes. But at a time when our friends at FinCEN are saying in 1 year, $212 billion in suspicious transactions tied to compromised identity. That's just 1 year. And I think we've all seen a lot of the other numbers as well. I mean, that's a big effing number. How is that not a security crisis, particularly when most of those dollars are going to organized criminals or hostile nations? I mean, the FBI's documented that identity compromises of crypto exchanges are being used to fund the North Korean nuclear program to the tune of a couple $2 billion. And we have nothing right now when it comes to a broader approach of how we're actually going to leverage the power of the government, which is the one authoritative issuer of identity. Mind you, that's a role split between federal, state, and local agencies, but it is an inherently governmental function to start to address some of these vulnerabilities in a way that closes security gaps and addresses privacy, hopefully in an ethical way, and ideally can serve as a platform that we can use to enable better digital experiences. I think what we are seeing right now is a lot of stuff going forward in a really disjointed way. So we're seeing the TSA move forward with mobile driver's license pilots in about a dozen states, but it's only on the in-person use cases, going through TSA checkpoint, buying a beer. I mean, I guess those are kind of nice to have, but then over here we've got hundreds of billions of dollars in identity-related crime. It would be nice if we had a broader policy focusing on how we might be able to leverage digital credentials on that front. Although I do want to call out the work that NIST is doing right here. So for those of you who don't know Bill Fisher, just look for the guy in the front of the room who has the best hair of anybody here. And work at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, starting to focus on some of the digital applications of MDLs. But I look at what's happening there, and then I look at what's happening with age verification laws in the states, where there's an assumption that we'll magically have age verification systems tied to identity. Or we're investing a couple $100 million in login.gov, which will basically focus on putting Americans through a digital version of the crappy experience they already went through at the DMV to just access government services. It's my third panel of the day. I've got a fireside chat with Hannah Kim, who's running Login as of about 2 weeks ago. She's lovely, by the way. We'll argue a little, but she's doing a good job. So all this is a long-winded way to say, if we're not thinking about this strategically from a policy perspective and thinking about the role that the government can play and thinking about as a digital identity ecosystem starts to emerge, what does good look like? How do we get there? What are the bad outcomes we want to avoid? And how do we take steps now to make sure we don't get there? I think that's what's really lacking in the U.S.
So, Kate, you've prepared this report. I'm just maybe in follow-up to Jeremy's question, what does good look like, for financial services or other sectors where there's a lot of victims in crime?
So at FinCEN, we address our regulations and our reporting requirements. And we aren't builders of infrastructure, but part of my remit was to understand what federal agency colleagues are doing. So we're pretty excited about what NIST is doing, particularly because they're prioritizing financial services as the first use case, and they're looking to prove to use a mobile driver's license, prove to the customer identification program role, and for authentication. So we're excited about that. We're also watching what Jeremy said about the fact that they're doing the in-person use case with multiple states. We're excited about that. We're looking forward to their notice of proposed rulemaking, setting minimum standards for federal acceptance of state mobile driver's license, setting minimum security privacy standards. We're also excited about DHS Science and Technology. For those that don't know, they're running the remote identity validation tech demo. It's called Riveted, without the E. If you're interested, they're testing the solution's abilities to detect a fake document, selfie, and liveness testing. And they're actually coming in and working with us on the identity project because they see that they have equities within broader DHS with respect to that. So there's a lot of interesting initiatives that are effectively piloting rulemaking, setting standards. NIST is integrating mobile driver's license and verifiable credentials into its revised digital identity guidelines. So we're excited to see what they do, and we benefit from the fact that Congress passed the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, and sections of it may have implications for how financial institutions collect and store PII, including in our section 6216, the modernization section, which directs a comprehensive consideration of whether the existing Bank Secrecy Act regulatory framework adequately safeguards the financial sector from
There's
threats.
also new regulations in New York as of November. Well, they're enhanced, Part 500, that are, if some don't care to follow the NIST guidelines, states are now coming out with new privacy laws and security guidelines. I don't know if you've followed what's going on in New York, but I'd love to see more states getting more aggressive in financial services and insurance that way. Maybe not, but there's some. I'm happy with seeing the updates that have come out from Part 500. Well, I'd like to turn the rest of this time over to the audience with some questions, if that's okay with you all. And the first, and to honor Kay's generous donation of a paper, I took the bait in Nashville last week. The first person to ask a question gets a paper. Do you still have that? Okay, John.
Thanks very much. Ethics boils down to don't be a dick. And if companies weren't dicks, then a lot of the privacy problems would be solved. But data protection, a lot of the regulations you talk about are ex post facto, complaint-driven after the fact. I wonder what your thoughts are of reformulating so that there's safety rules when you build stuff, to the point you made, Michelle.
Principles-based privacy is about don't collect the information you don't need.
Yeah, they're not formulated that way. So, and as of 20, I've got both mics now.
They're by and large complaint driven, though. You're supposed to do that, but you don't find out that you don't do it. You don't have an attestation like a building code, right? There's no.
But that's not how the actual structure of the laws are not that way. I mean, how they're actually being enforced, I totally agree with that. But as of 2010 in Jerusalem, privacy by design is the law of the land for all of the organized and civilized countries, the United States accepted, because we don't have a federal law in the United States. And it wasn't until we had the crap amendment to the California law that we had even privacy by design in the California law. Even China has privacy by design in their law. And I know because I went there in 2005 to help them put it in there. So it is the law of the land that you are supposed to systemically, in advance, review your systems, build your systems, have privacy protections, data protections, systemic controls, planned, executed, and done. Why our nations aren't doing this, why we're not being held accountable, I do not know. But it is complaint-driven at this point. But hear this, and hear this now. The class action bar is coming. So if you are in an organization, the class action bar will find standing, and it will be ugly. So either get it done now or get it done on the tail end because you're going to have to, because you're going to get sued into oblivion, and you're going to have to get it done. So the proactive companies are getting it done. It's painful that it's not happening because you should do it. It's good for business. I work with clients that are recovering billions of dollars because they're not doing silly things like simple things like data quality. They've got a P.O. box as the system of record address, and they're sending out a call for a repair guy who's on a union contract for $200. So he goes out to a P.O. box. Guess what? That guy's getting paid. That happens hundreds and hundreds of times. It costs the company $8 billion. Once we corrected the identity problems, he goes out to the correct call, he delivers the part, the SLA is met, customer is happy. We recouped $8 billion because of identity, because of quality. God bless you. God bless the unions. That's privacy in motion.
I got a question here, Steve. You touched on data minimization, and Michelle, you touched on looking at forcing us or prompting us, identity professionals, to think about PIO and systems of systems. So kind of want to get your take on the world of consumer marketing and digital advertising, the amount of data inferences and correlation and identity approximation and resolution that's being done there. From your perspective, has it hit a identity plus privacy crisis point yet? If not, what can us identity professionals do? Because we mostly think about access controls and things of that nature. That is another world that might be curious to get your take on.
Yeah, I think the Europeans really stuck it to Google, and then Apple kind of stuck its finger in the air and said, we're privacy forward. We'll see if that really plays out in reality. But in a day, they cost Facebook $25 billion in one day. So the ad tech world has been driving this, and the money is just undeniable. So nothing happened because there were just trillions and trillions of dollars, and it was just undeniable. It was a swarm of greed, and no one could deny it. But I think because the way that you're allowed to collect information, the power of some of this legislation slowly creeping up on the ad tech business, the quality and the other huge bullet of trillions of dollars in AI, and the false promise and false flag of AI coming on board, you're going to start to see the repackaging of advertising impressions being tied to real identities, causing a new economic reality that identity is going to come as a resurgent economic powerhouse.
Michelle, Steve, Jeremy, Kay, thank you so much. We tried to pack a lot into this, and I'm sorry for pushing us through this process. It's a big subject. Thank you all for coming. Please give a hand. Thank you.